Hi, my name is Fabian Pröse. This video is about data cleaning and preparation. Whenever you collect data, you would like to analyze the data. But before you can do so, it is very important to carefully screen and clean and prepare the data. So this video is exactly about that. I will talk about three things. First, about data cleaning, how to clean the data. Second, I will talk about bias. So what could be the problem with the data? And then third, of course, what can we do to reduce that bias? Why do we care about data cleaning? Why is it important? Imagine you receive data, lots of data, hundreds of thousands of respondents, and they filled out a survey and they filled out all kinds of things, and there might be all kinds of problems of wrong data. And if you include all this wrong, false, strange data, that would lead to very strange results, very strange data analysis. So in order to prevent that, you would first collect the data, then you would screen and clean that data, and only afterwards you can analyze the data. Talking about the raw data you receive as a researcher. As I mentioned, there can be all kinds of problems or noise within that data. Let me talk about some of the most common problems of raw data and why we cannot really use such kind of data for analysis. First, we can think about unwanted respondents. You may include some filter question at the beginning. Remember, when we talk about survey design, you can filter data. And it could be, to give an example, one example would be you would like to conduct a study about pregnant women. Then your survey was maybe also men or women who are not pregnant responded to your survey. Then it doesn't really make sense to analyze that data. It could be another common problem would be incomplete responses. So you have some respondents, you have a survey, maybe it is 100 questions long, and some respondents only fill out 50 questions. And very important questions are unanswered. And that's related to my next point, missing values. It could be there could be some systematic way of missing values. It could be that the respondents only fills out the first questions and then gets very tired and then drops out. Or it could also be that respondents don't like certain questions. They feel uncomfortable or they're not sure how to respond and they leave these questions blank. Or maybe just no special reason, just the respondent is very quickly responding to this online survey and then misses a couple of questions. And then it could also that we have some useless variables, and that could be part of the problematic survey design, but also data entry when people respond to the survey. Another also problem that can happen is that respondents enter wrong answers. That could be by intention or unintentionally. Let me give you an example. You have the question age. How old are you? And some respondents write then 1980, so 1980. So they're not 1980 years old, but maybe they thought, which year were you born? And that's why they entered this kind of number. There are many different examples for why people intentionally or unintentionally enter wrong numbers. In online surveys, it is quite a concern that you have unengaged respondents. That sounds somewhat abstract, but to give you a more specific idea. You fill out a survey. It's very long, 100 questions, maybe 200 questions, and after some time you get tired, annoyed, and you just click 5, enter. Yeah, and that would be an unengaged respondent who doesn't even read the questions and just enters or some kind of number or some point, and that is problematic. And we did in fact do one online panel research, and we noticed that almost 20% showed some indication of unengaged respondents. And that's very problematic because any relations between these variables are not based on real feelings, intentions, attitudes and so forth, but just because someone only clicked the same button all over. So you get the feeling already now that raw data can include all kinds of noise, problems, or what we call a bias. Now, I've already mentioned bias. Let us talk more about bias, what it is and why it is such a problem. Bias is when we analyze data. There are things that can lead us to wrong conclusions. It's not because actually that's what is in the data or what reality has, but because of some problems in our data, which could be partially because we did not clean our data properly. So I think we can distinguish between, let's say, 3 different biases, or the context they are within. So first would be things that bias the parameter estimates. So the coefficients, they could be too high, too low, because of certain biases. Then there could be also a bias in the standard errors or confidence intervals. Remember, we have mean values, standard deviation, standard errors, and confidence intervals. And that could be also strongly influenced by certain biases. And then a third one is also, for many statistical analysis, we have certain assumptions, and if those are not met, then we have maybe also that the bias can influence test statistics or p-values and so forth. All that leads to results that are not a true reflection of reality, but influenced by certain biases. Typical biases that we can observe would be due to outliers, so you have some values that are way above or below. Remember the example of age, 1980. This is so much older than any other person. If we take that as face value, then maybe and that person has a certain tendency to be high on certain values that would bias the whole results upwards because of one outlier. Or as already mentioned before, you have certain assumptions. Assumptions of a normal distribution or other assumptions that need to be met so that test results are reliable. I've already mentioned outliers. Outliers is a data point that is very far off the mean values or the median. So you have lots of values in a certain range, and then you have some values that are so much higher or lower. For instance, one example, you look at small and medium-sized enterprises and you ask them about how much sales they generate. Small and medium-sized enterprises is a very broad spectrum. It includes some micro firms, but already some firms which could be considered large companies. So let's assume the average sales of these small and medium-sized enterprises might be $1 million, which is already quite a lot. Yeah, but it could also be if in the survey you include a micro company with a few employees and they generate only, let's say, $10,000. And then you have a very large SMEs, which by some definition would not be a small or medium-sized enterprises, but in Germany we call many big companies also as SMEs or Mittelstand companies. So there could be one company that has sales of, let's say, $5 billion. And then you have the sales outcome as a dependent variable, as independent variables, where you would like to ask what is the number of migrant workers employed in that company. And then maybe this company that has very little sales has only migrant workers. And because of this very small number, the average is much higher, but this has a very low sales. And that would lead to the conclusion that migrants would be associated with lower sales. But if it's only driven by this one outlier, this could have very substantial influence on the results. It would bias the results. And so it's a problem if we have numbers that are so much below or so much above the majority of data points. And that could have very substantial influence on the results. To check for outliers, I think there are different options. You can simply screen your data and look at values high, low, or you can also create box plots or other methods how to identify outliers. What should we do with an outlier? There are many options. Here, just give you an idea. First, if you identify outliers, the first thing is you would like to check the data. Is that maybe a coding error, wrongly coded data, or is there wrong input by the respondent. And maybe that already fixes the problem, but very often it won't. The next step, what you could do is you could run the analysis both with and without the outliers. If the findings are consistent, then the outlier might not have such a strong effect on the results. Very often it can also be it is different. So with and without outliers you have different results. If so, you could try to quiz the data and also your own feeling and maybe other experts trying to find an answer for this phenomenon. Maybe there's a substantial reason behind it. And then it would be very interesting to get to know more about it. So there's a lot of information in these outliers we would like to understand. Then there's more ways how to respond and how to treat outliers, and that I will talk in the third part of today's video. Assumptions. An assumption is a condition that ensures that what you're attempting to do works. We have many assumptions in the various kind of multivariate statistical analysis. If assumptions are violated, the test results are not reliable, or we may need to conduct different types of statistical analysis, different equations, and so forth. Among the assumptions, I think, let me briefly talk about 4 main assumptions. For me, I start laughing because these assumptions are kind of tongue twisters, very difficult to pronounce. Let me try, please forgive me. So one would be additivity and linearity. Another one would be normality or normal distribution. And now it comes, the next one would be homoscedasticity or homogeneity or variance. Well, I'm quite happy, I did it quite well this time, it's difficult. And independence. I will talk about each of these assumptions in more detail in the following. Let me talk a bit more about additivity and linearity. What does it mean? So the basic assumption is here that the outcome variable is linearly, so upwards or downwards like a linear related to predictors. So we can plot a line, upward line or downward line. And the idea is that if you combine multiple predictors, and they would add, each predictor would add something. That's the idea of addition or additivity and some kind of linearity. So we can plot a line between the predictors and the outcome variable. Normal distributions relate to many of the things that we want to assess, that we want to test and run various kind of statistical analysis for. Probably you have seen many times the normal distribution curve. You can see it on the right hand side. It's a gentle slope with a high peak and then it goes down in both directions. That's a typical distribution. If you're a student, probably you might have seen normal distribution of grades from A to F and so forth, normally distributed among students. The normal distribution is a very central assumption in most statistical analysis. And it's also key to provide correct parameter estimates and also the confidence intervals and whether a null hypothesis is significant or not. And then also for standard errors and so forth. So normal distribution is one of the key assumptions in most statistical analysis. We've talked about normal distribution. The assumption of normality is related to normal distribution. I think however, you need to be somewhat careful because normality sometimes means different things. It could mean that the confidence intervals around parameter estimates, that the estimate must come from a normal distribution. It could, however, also be that the significance of models, that the whole sampling distribution must be normal. Or the estimates of the parameters. So the residuals of the population must be normally distributed. Some of these things are somewhat related, but depending on what test you would like to implement, I think you have to consider different types of normality. Homoscedasticity and homogeneity of variance. My favorite tongue twisters. I think this assumption is particularly important for group comparisons, such as ANOVA, MANCOVA and so forth, but also for a couple of other tests. So it's about residuals at each level of the predictor should have the same variance, in particular if you compare different groups. If not, then it is heteroscedasticity, or no homogeneity of variance. If you run more statistical programs, it will automatically compute Levene's tests. And then you can see whether it's met or not. And if this assumption is not met, then the results might be not robust, or some statistical programs provide you different statistics that are more robust if this assumption is violated. That's also a very important assumption for most multivariate statistical analysis. Under independence, we understand that the errors in your model are not related to each other. So the different variables and their error terms are not related. So far we have talked about data cleaning and biases. I think that's very important to obtain an understanding. Next, we would like to know what can we do against these biases? How can we reduce biases? Let me give you some ideas. I think there are many ways how to respond to it. Here I would like to talk about the most common ones. Let me begin with one way, which is probably the most common, regardless of your major you're studying, which will be trimming the data, meaning deleting some data. It could be, if you have these outliers, you could simply delete those outliers, or some other problematic data. You would reduce your data, delete the data that causes these problems, that violate certain assumptions and so forth. And that is fairly common. If you read research papers, you don't see much about the details about this process. But as a thorough researcher, it is very important to document why and how did you trim the data, and you need also good justification. Because are you deleting meaningful data, or is it meaningful to delete the data? Are there good reasons for it? The second point would be winsorizing. Winsorizing is very common in finance research. It is not so common in other areas or disciplines. So essentially it refers to also to reducing certain outliers. You have these extreme outliers and you would winsorize them to a certain level. Very often they say 95% winsorizing. So you will take only up to the 95% of the data, and that will be the maximum point. Any point that goes above will get the value of the 95% value. Or you could also add certain values. In finance, I read very often it would be 95% or whatever percentage. You will cut the data and limit the data. Not so common, I would say, in human resource management research and some other areas. Then we talked about many of these assumptions. If these assumptions are not met, you have certain biases. Sometimes a certain statistical procedure does not work, but there are other statistical procedures and statistical analysis available, and you would revert to them because they're more robust if certain assumptions are being violated. Then a more other way would be to transform the data. Some part of transformation is very common in all kinds of disciplines, and some other more statistical transformations are more common, let's say in statistics or psychology, but less so in other disciplines. Let me talk a bit more about transformation of data in the following. There are different ways how to transform data. Let me begin with the easy ones. Recoding data. Data can be coded in different ways, but it's important that we code them in a meaningful way for data analysis. So it could be we want to make more sense out of it. It could also sometimes mean we have a scale, liking. How much do you like cheese? And then it could be originally coded from 1, I like it a lot, to 7, I don't like it at all. But in that way, we would have higher scores, would mean I like it less, which would be kind of irritating. So we may want to recode it. Higher values means higher liking of something. Another problem could be also coding errors. We have coded something wrongly, by mistake, and then we would like to fix that. Or maybe also for consistency. So we analyze a lot of also dummy variables, binary 0, 1, yes or no. Do you have a job? Yes, no. Are you married? Yes, no. In the survey, usually the data comes at 1 and 2. But for data analysis, we prefer 0 and 1. So we would need to recode this 1, 2 into 0, 1. So there are many such simple reasons why it would be important, or at least helpful, to recode data. There are other ways or reasons why you would like to recode and transform data. Sometimes you would like to simplify or form categories. For example, in my line of research, we look at different country clusters. And we have a Germanic cluster, Anglo-Saxon cluster, and different cultural clusters. And we would then combine certain countries, such as Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Netherlands would belong to the Germanic cluster. Or we have China, Korea, Japan, they would be part of the Confucian cluster. And then we would combine these countries into one cultural region, and then maybe we would compare different regions. And so, meaning we would recode these four or five different countries into the same coding for that cultural cluster. Then what is also very common in social science research is that we create scales, where we put several items together. Remember, in my video on survey design, I talk about why it is very important and also helpful to combine certain items into a scale. So we have more variance and so forth. So many good reasons why we would create scales and why then we would need to recode or transform our data. So far, I've mainly talked about recoding of data, simple form of data transformations. There are more advanced methods. There are some various types of statistical transformations of data. What we see a lot in business research, mainly in finance, strategy research and so forth, is that scholars apply logarithm over the data. So what that essentially does, it takes out these extreme values and gives more logarithm type of distribution of variables. Another very common form of transformation of data would be to standardize data. It could be standardized around the standard deviation. Standard deviation becomes 1 and around 0, or you would mean center variables, so different ways of transformations. These types of transformations are very common in social science when we would like to look at interaction effects. We will talk about more in another video about that. So these are still very common data transformation, logarithm and standardizing or mean centering data. In addition, there's almost limitless, endless opportunities to transform your data to make them more normally distributed or other ways. In business research, we usually don't do that. But I do know in statistics and in some other areas, it is common practice to better fit your data so you can run certain statistical analysis. But as I said, probably in business, social science, it's rather uncommon. In this video, I talked about data cleaning, biases, and how to reduce such biases. I think my main message that I wanted to convey, it is extremely important to clean and prepare your data. Only then you can analyze your data and obtain meaningful and reliable results. Alright, so I hope that was helpful, and I wish you to have fun with your data cleaning and data analysis.